This is a book by Professor Arthur Veno. He's a bit of an interesting character. Apparently he calls some of the gypsy jokers and others friends. It's from 2009, called the Brotherhoods. It's got inside the outlaw motorcycle clubs. It says now completely revised and updated, including Sydney bikie wars and the new anti-bikie laws. This is 2009, so it's a bit out of date, but let's read a little bit of it. The Australian motorcycle club scene kicked in just as I arrived in the country, so I naturally kept an interested eye on what was happening. It wasn't until 1981, though, that the professional interest I maintain today began to develop. That year I went to Bathurst for the annual Australian Motorcycle Grand Prix, only to find myself in the midst of another watershed event for the motorcycle movement. Tension between the police and the bikers, which had been brewing for years, finally boiled over. Yeah, there weren't all bikies in the Bathurst, I think a mixture of people. A massive riot that year, so that was 1981. I was only 8 when that happened. Yeah. Boy, was it a blue. 90 police were injured and 100 arrests were made. It turns out there had been rioting between the bikers and police at the races on and off since an accident in the late 70s when police had driven over a woman sleeping on the ground, scalping her. In an already highly charged atmosphere, it proved the trigger that caused the situation to explode. After my experiences at Bathurst, I applied for a grant from the Australian Institute of Criminology to study why the riots were occurring and how the event could be run more peacefully. They loved my application, offering me more money than I'd asked for. Of course I accepted. Good on you, Veno. Professor Veno. Arthur Veno. Good on you, Arthur. My wife, Elizabeth, and later into the project, a student of mine, Rudy Krasiker, joined me in looking at the problem. We were an interesting team. Elizabeth had a BA in psychology. However, more importantly for the study, she had served in the police force for 3 years. Rudy, on the other hand, is a dedicated biker with a thirst for understanding what's going on around him. We interviewed and surveyed bikers, police and townsfolk. For 3 years we studied the event, sending people in to mingle with the bikers and to see what was going on. In that time we felt we'd worked out the problem. A report to the Australian Criminology Research Council, which is comprised of the most senior bureaucracies of the justice system in all states and territories, indicated that it was the policing style that was the fundamental cause of the violence. In other words, the police being intimidating people, bullying people, until they got their ass kicked at Bathurst. The report fell upon deaf ears in the New South Wales Police Force. Surprise, surprise. Instead, they chose the opposite path, adopting a get tough stance. This only served to produce the most violent clashes ever seen at Bathurst, with more than 525 charges laid after a massive riot in 1985. By this time, many bikers had grown sick of the violence and decided to boycott the following year's event. Crowds dropped in less than a quarter of previous years, eventually driving the Grand Prix out of Bathurst and down to Phillip Island in Victoria. In contrast, Victoria Police, in contrast, the Victoria Police took over recommendations on board, and Liz, Rudy and I were appointed advisors in the Major Incident Planning Unit, which was designing the Phillip Island event. Good on you, Arthur. Our plan worked fantastically. For instance, when the Coffin Cheaters flew their flag from the island's major hotel, we were able to talk to all the clubs to make sure it wasn't a problem. Our senior Hells Angel from the club's Nomad chapter met with the police and sorted out the issue in a few minutes. Without this level of consultation, the action probably would have led to violence between the clubs. It was great for those first few years. We had cops and bikies riding together to make sure everyone kept the peace at the event. Both sides agreed it was one of the best run bike events ever held. Unfortunately, it went off the rails a few years after our involvement, because these sorts of initiatives need constant tweaking. By 2000 it was back on track when the police realised they had to get the clubs and bikers involved again. My work with the Grand Prix at Bathurst opened many doors to the clubs for me. In 1986, the Hells Angels asked my team to monitor the police roadblocks at their annual Broadford concert north of Melbourne. The club has been staging the weekend event since 1976, attracting about 4,000 people each year. At least 15 outlaw motorcycle clubs attended the 25-hectare campsite, where each club had its own camp. There you go. Having your own camp doesn't stop punch-ups though, but anyway, that's my view on that. But some of these things can be fairly peaceful, and you've got 4,000 people back in there with different clubs coming together, getting along. There you go. The police welcomed our involvement. They regard the outlaw motorcycle clubs as a serious problem, and to outlaw motorcycle clubs hold the reciprocal view of the police. To have someone in the middle liaising was perfect for both groups. The major problem at Broadford was the Hells Angels' view that the concert was a private event, meaning police were not permitted on site. The police disagreed, saying that because alcohol was being served at the venue, they had the right to enter. They never actually entered the property though, preferring to sit at the gates and monitor the comings and goings of the bikies. Up to 50 extra police converged on the town for the event each December. I went along to the briefing for these police and was staggered to find the Australian Federal Police had sent a contingent of officers carrying photos of outlaw motorcycle club members wanted by police. It was believed they might show at the event. On the Friday, the first day of the concert, but police set up a roadblock, complete with sniffer dogs, on the only sealed road leading from Broadford to the concert venue. If that's not going to provoke people, what is? 10 kilometres from town, every car, motorcycle and occasional pedestrian was stopped and thoroughly searched for drugs, weapons and even explosives. The roadblock was in place 24 hours a day for the duration of the concert. Apart from 1 or 2 arrests for possession of cannabis, there was only one moment of excitement when at about 5 p.m. on the Friday, as cars and bikes slowly inched their way through the roadblock, one biker made a run for it. He was close to being searched when must have had something on him, when he suddenly gunned the bike and shot off the road and headed for a small gap beside the roadblock. The cops got a shock when they saw him roaring past towards the entrance to the concert ground. The rider didn't realise that waiting further down the road, around a corner, were 2 police cars. When he saw them, he did a U-turn and headed back toward the roadblock. The police were ready for him this time round and had posted a strong young male sergeant on the path where the biker had evaded the roadblock only minutes before. It was pretty tense. It was clear the biker meant to burst through the blockade again, but was blocked by the police, who were frantically waving their arms in the hope that they would stop him. Meanwhile, the young sergeant took a different course of action. Next to the path lay some freshly chopped saplings. He grabbed one and held it across the path to stop the rider. The biker could still see some light beneath the now overhanging sapling and decided to gun for the narrow passage at full throttle. As he reached the path around the roadblock, the sergeant dropped the tree, smacking the bloke fair in the face at about 80 kilometres per hour. The cops jumped on him and searched him thoroughly before carting him off to hospital with a broken collarbone. He was clean, which puzzled the police. They later discovered he'd recently been released from mental hospital, to which I hope he was returned upon recovering from his injuries. It was always a game of cat and mouse between the clubs and police at Broadford. It didn't take long for the bikies wanted by police to figure out a hassle-free way to get into the concert. Turn up a day early. There were some more sophisticated strategies too. One year, the mid-90s, a helicopter was used to ferry a band onto the site. It also carried a few extra passengers who may have otherwise had trouble arriving in the conventional way. Why is that? Because they are wanted? I'll wind it up in a sec. Strangely enough, there was a second unpaved road that gave access to the concert site, but it meant a 60-kilometre detour on a rough, unsealed road. To someone on the police wanted list, however, enduring 60 kilometres of bone-jarring gravel and ruts was considered a better option than facing 60 days in the slammer. That might be a lot longer than that if you're wanted for serious crime. The police didn't patrol it until the late 1980s, when they finally cottoned on to what was happening. We completed our report, which went to both the police and the Hells Angels. The gist of it was that the police were remarkably restrained in light of the briefing they received. From the club side, the bikers were well behaved, so self-policing at the event was all that was required. Most of my research work is done not to find out how the clubs operate, but to look at events such as Broadford, where there is friction between the bikers and the police. The goal of the research has been to understand the clubs well enough to develop a viable and appropriate form of policing them. Naturally, over the years I've got to know the clubs pretty well, attending club nights and field days of clubs such as the Coffin Cheaters and Hells Angels. And Coffin Cheaters, Hells Angels. And this is a quote. I don't really agree with it, but it's interesting. We are modern day heroes like Ned Kelly. Mr. Average would be happy being told by the government what to think when to drink, when to fuck. That's not us. We are the last free people in society. And the first bit's interesting. Chapter 1, The Mad Professor. This is about Arthur Veno himself. Let's go get a cup of coffee. At Macca's, they said. Who was I to argue? The guys suggesting it were only the kingpins in one of the meanest bikie clubs in the land who'd asked me along to a meeting to discuss a few things. As I tentatively climbed into what turned out to be an extraordinarily loud car, I somehow knew there wasn't going to be any coffee. My ass is grass, I thought. There was some small talk. They talked, I felt small. Then they told me what was going on. I was at once relieved and frightened. They didn't want to kill me, but they wanted to do the next best thing. Get me to grouse a bikie. They told me how they had a problem with one of their members and his amphetamine factory. They wanted me to act as a go-between to dump him in it. At that point, I became one of the few outsiders to be not only privy to, but actually involved in outlaw club business. This was incredible stuff. To dob in a brother in the bikie world is the greatest sin, yet here I was being asked to do just that. I'd lay a bet I was the first professor to ever be asked to do such a thing. I'd also bet I was the first professor mad enough to get myself into that situation. I tell that story, which I'll expand on later, to answer the most common question people ask me. What does a middle-aged professor know about outlaw motorcycle clubs? Or more specifically, what can someone who's never been a club member and who rarely rides a motorcycle reveal about bikie clubs? I'd ask the same questions. My answer is that things are not always what they seem. Gangs and bikie clubs are my professional and personal passion. I am often referred to as Australia's foremost independent expert on the outlaw motorcycle clubs because I've been studying them for 27 years, and this is in 2009. This currently makes me one of a small group of academics in the world who have made it their focus. However, before I get into all that, I'd better tell you a bit about myself and how I fell into the world of the outlaw motorcycle clubs. I'm a Yank born in Burlington, Vermont, just below the Canadian border in 1945. These days I lived in Australia and hold dual Australian American citizenship. No sooner could I walk than Dad, a sergeant major in the US Army, began his round of international postings. By the age of 12, I'd lived in Greece, Germany, Italy, France and Turkey before we returned to the United States, to a town called Monterey, about 106 kilometers south of San Francisco. An accident was to occur in the town a few years later that changed the image of motorcycle clubs forever. That event also changed my life, for I was caught right in the thick of it. So it was around some sort of bikie violence. Anyway, thanks for reading.